Claire had spent 3 weeks preparing for her husband Richard's annual charity gala. As the co-founder of a mid-sized architecture firm, Richard had built his reputation on precision, charm, and control. 3 things Claire had learned to live around during their 8 years of marriage. She'd chosen a deep emerald gown for the evening, one that Richard himself had picked out weeks earlier, insisting it would photograph well for the event coverage. She hadn't questioned it. She rarely questioned anything about these events anymore. They were Richard's world, and she had long since accepted her role in it. The quiet, well-dressed wife who smiled at the right moments and disappeared into the background when the real conversations began. The ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and white orchids, exactly as it had the previous 3 years. Claire greeted guests, exchanged pleasantries with business partners whose names she barely remembered, and watched as Richard moved through the crowd like he owned the room, which, in every sense that mattered to him, he did. She noticed the way he laughed a little too loudly around his business partner's daughter, a woman named Vanessa who had joined the firm 18 months ago. Claire had noticed things like that before. She had simply chosen, each time, not to look too closely. As the evening progressed toward its charity auction segment, usually reserved for vacation packages, art pieces, and dinner reservations with local celebrities, Richard took the stage earlier than scheduled. He tapped the microphone, flashing the confident smile that had once made Claire fall for him in a crowded coffee shop a decade ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we have a very special final item, one you won't find anywhere else." Claire assumed he meant a piece of art or perhaps a weekend getaway package the event committee had arranged. She continued her conversation with a guest near the bar, only half listening. Then she heard her own name. "My beautiful wife, Claire," Richard announced, gesturing toward her with a theatrical sweep of his hand, "has agreed to be tonight's final auction item. A dinner date with Claire, for a starting bid of just $20. The room fell into a strange, uncertain laughter, the kind of laughter people offer when they aren't sure if something is a joke. Claire felt her face grow hot, her heart pounding as every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. She hadn't agreed to anything. She hadn't been asked. Richard hadn't so much as mentioned this to her beforehand, and yet there he stood, waiting for her to play along, exactly as she always had. For a moment, Claire considered doing exactly that. Smiling, walking to the stage, letting the room laugh it off as another one of Richard's charming stunts. It was, after all, what she had always done. But something in her chest shifted that night, something that had been quietly cracking for months, maybe years, finally giving way. She thought of every dinner she'd sat through in silence, every decision made on her behalf, every time she had shrunk herself smaller so Richard could stand taller. As the bidding began, a voice calling out $20 from a table near the back, followed by scattered chuckles. Claire realized this wasn't just a bad joke. It was the clearest picture she had ever been given of exactly how her husband saw her. Claire did not walk to the stage. Instead, she set down her glass, straightened her shoulders, and began walking, not toward Richard, but toward the exit. The room grew quiet in a different way now, an uneasy hush spreading as guests realized this wasn't part of the act. Richard's smile faltered for the first time all evening. "Claire," he called out, half laughing, half panicked. "Come on, it's just a joke, don't be dramatic." But Claire didn't turn around. She had spent 8 years absorbing his jokes, his casual dismissals, his quiet controlling behavior disguised as charm, and something inside her had simply run out of room to keep absorbing. Outside the ballroom, in the quiet marble hallway of the hotel, Claire allowed herself to breathe for the first time all night. Her hands were shaking, not from embarrassment, but from a strange, unfamiliar clarity. She thought about the architecture firm Richard had built, the one she had helped fund in its earliest years with money from her late grandmother's inheritance. Money Richard had conveniently forgotten to credit whenever investors asked about the company's origin story. She thought about the promotion she had turned down at her own job 3 years earlier because Richard insisted her presence at his events mattered more than her career. She thought about how small she had allowed herself to become. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa, of all people. "I'm so sorry about tonight. That wasn't okay. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Claire stared at the message, unsure whether to feel gratitude or suspicion. She had seen the way Richard looked at Vanessa, the extra minutes he spent near her at these events, the late nights he claimed were client dinners. Claire had never had proof, only instinct. But instinct, she was beginning to realize, had rarely failed her over the years. She had simply chosen not to trust it. By the time Richard found her in the hallway, his charming stage persona had dissolved into irritation. "You embarrassed me in there," he said, voice low so passing guests wouldn't hear. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of it, that he could stand in front of 200 people, auction off his wife like a raffle prize, and somehow still believe she was the one who had done something wrong. "You auctioned me off, Richard," she said quietly, "for $20. In front of your business partners, your clients, everyone." Richard rolled his eyes. "It was a joke, Claire. You're being sensitive." That word, sensitive, landed with a weight it had never carried before. She had heard it 100 times over the years, always used to shrink her feelings into something smaller and more manageable for him. That night, driving home in silence, Claire made a decision she had circled around for years without ever fully committing to it. She wasn't sure yet what it would look like, or how difficult it would be, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not keep making herself smaller for a man who had never once considered making room for her at all. The following week, Claire began quietly reviewing years of financial documents she had never paid close attention to. As a former accountant before she'd left her career to support Richard's ambitions, the skill hadn't entirely left her, it had simply gone dormant. She started with the firm's founding paperwork, the one she had helped finance with her grandmother's inheritance nearly a decade earlier. What she found made her sit back in her chair, stunned. Her name wasn't listed anywhere as a founding investor. Richard had restructured the company's ownership documents 3 years into the marriage, quietly removing every trace of her financial contribution, listing himself as the sole founding partner. Claire spent the next several nights after Richard fell asleep combing through old bank statements, emails, and investment records she had access to but had simply never thought to question. She found transfers to an account she didn't recognize, small but consistent payments over the past year and a half, the kind of pattern that suggested something ongoing rather than incidental. She cross-referenced dates with the client dinners Richard often mentioned, the late nights, the trips that always seemed to align suspiciously well with conferences Vanessa also attended. The picture forming in front of her wasn't just about a humiliating auction anymore. It was about years of careful, quiet erasure of her contributions, her voice, her place in the very life she had helped build. She reached out to a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Reyes who specialized in business and family law, recommended by an old college friend Claire hadn't spoken to in years but had reconnected with after the gala. Patricia listened carefully as Claire laid out everything. The ownership documents, the financial discrepancies, the years of quiet diminishment disguised as marriage. "You have more leverage here than you realize," Patricia told her. "Your original investment, if we can prove it, changes the entire ownership structure of that company. This isn't just about a divorce, Claire. This is about reclaiming what was legally yours from the beginning." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire felt something other than exhaustion when she thought about her marriage. She felt purpose. She began gathering documents methodically, quietly, careful not to alert Richard to what she now understood with painful clarity, that she had spent nearly a decade shrinking herself for a man who had been actively working, in small and calculated ways, to erase her entirely, long before he ever stood on that stage and put a $20 price tag on her worth. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to sense a shift in her but mistook it for something else entirely. He began overcompensating, bringing home flowers, suggesting weekend trips, telling her how much the gala incident had taught him. Claire smiled politely through these gestures, playing the role she had perfected over the years, all while Patricia's office quietly built a case that would, within weeks, change everything Richard believed he understood about his marriage, his company, and the wife he had so carelessly underestimated. 3 weeks after the gala, Richard called Claire into what he described as an important family meeting, though Claire suspected, correctly, that it was less about family and more about business. He explained, with visible discomfort, that the firm was facing an audit due to inconsistencies flagged by a routine financial review, and that his lawyer had recommended clarifying the company's original ownership structure just as a formality. Claire listened calmly, already knowing exactly what kind of inconsistencies an audit would uncover, having spent the past 3 weeks documenting them herself with Patricia's guidance. "I need you to sign something," Richard said, sliding a document across the table. A formal waiver relinquishing any historical financial claim to the company, framed as routine paperwork to keep things simple. Claire looked at the document, then at her husband, recognizing the moment for exactly what it was. Not a formality, but a desperate attempt to erase the last remaining evidence of what he had spent years trying to hide. "I'm not signing this, Richard," she said quietly. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to panic. "Claire, this is serious. If the audit finds problems and you're not cooperating, it could affect both of us." "It's already affecting both of us," Claire replied, pulling out a folder of her own, copies of the original investment documents, the altered ownership records, the financial transfers she had traced to an account linked, through careful research, to a property Vanessa had purchased 18 months earlier. Richard's face drained of color as she laid each document on the table, one by one, calmly and without raising her voice. "I know about the transfers, Richard. I know about the ownership changes. I know about Vanessa. I've known for weeks, and I have documentation for all of it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Claire could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. Richard opened his mouth several times without finding words, the confident, commanding persona he wore so effortlessly in boardrooms and galas nowhere to be found in his own kitchen, facing the wife he had spent a decade underestimating. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice smaller than Claire had ever heard it. "I want what's legally mine," Claire said simply. "And I want a divorce." Patricia had prepared her well for this exact moment, walking her through every possible reaction Richard might have: anger, denial, bargaining. What Claire hadn't expected was the quiet, almost childlike defeat that settled over him once he realized there was no charm left to deploy, no room left to talk his way around what she now had in writing. For the first time in their marriage, Richard wasn't the one controlling the narrative. And for Claire, watching him sit in stunned silence at their kitchen table, that shift felt less like victory and more like the simple, long-overdue restoration of balance. The divorce proceedings took 4 months, complicated by the ownership dispute over the architecture firm that Patricia had carefully built a case around. In the end, the original investment documents Claire had uncovered proved undeniable. She was legally entitled to a substantial percentage of the company she had helped fund nearly a decade earlier, a percentage Richard had spent years quietly trying to erase from existence. Rather than fight a losing legal battle that would have dragged both his reputation and the firm's public image through the mud, Richard agreed to a settlement that gave Claire both a financial stake and, more importantly to her, a public acknowledgement of her original contribution to the company's founding. Claire didn't return to the architecture firm. Instead, she used her settlement, combined with the skills she'd let sit dormant for nearly a decade, to open a small financial consulting practice of her own, helping women navigate business partnerships and protect their financial interests in ways she wished someone had helped her understand years earlier. Her first clients came through word of mouth, friends of Patricia's, a few guests from that infamous gala who had reached out privately in the weeks following the story's quiet spread through their social circle, curious how the woman auctioned off for $20 had ended up walking away with considerably more than she'd started with. Vanessa and Richard's relationship, as Claire later learned through mutual acquaintances, didn't survive the fallout of the scandal or the financial strain of the settlement. It turned out that admiration built on secrecy and quiet betrayal rarely held up once exposed to daylight. Claire felt no satisfaction in this, only a distant, quiet confirmation of what she had already understood. That the foundation Richard had built his life on, in business and in marriage, had never been as solid as his confidence suggested. A year after the gala, Claire attended a charity event of her own, one she had helped organize through her new practice, supporting a local non-profit that assisted women rebuilding their finances after divorce or separation. Standing at the podium, addressing a room considerably smaller and far less glamorous than the Whitmore Ballroom, Claire spoke briefly about worth. Not the kind assigned by someone else at a microphone, but the kind a person builds quietly, deliberately, for themselves. She didn't mention Richard by name. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room, in their own way, understood exactly what she meant. As she left the podium that evening, Claire caught her reflection in the glass doors of the small community centre hosting the event. No chandeliers, no orchids, no borrowed spotlight. Just her own, steady, and entirely her own for the first time in longer than she could remember. She smiled, not for an audience this time, but simply because, for the first time in years, she finally recognized the woman looking back.